Lady Jane Grey was just 16 years old when she was beheaded at the Tower of London in 1554. A secret plot had unexpectedly placed Jane on the English throne, usurping Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII. Just 9 days later, an outraged Mary stormed into London with a crowd of supporters and swiftly took back her throne. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London and later executed. If ever there was a political pawn, it was Jane Grey, a child who unwillingly found herself in the middle of a coup to steal an empire. Jane's fate was undeniably tragic, and when searching for suspects on which to cast the blame, several arise. But one in particular may have gotten more blame than she deserved. Over the almost 500 years since all of this drama went down, Frances Grey, Jane's mother, has been cast as evil, controlling, and abusive. She fills the role as the perfect evil villain in the next great historical drama, akin to Cinderella's evil stepmother or the evil queen in Snow White. As far as constructing a good story goes, it works. Everyone loves an evil mother figure for some reason. But who was Frances Grey really? Was she really as bad as her reputation would have us believe? And what part did she actually play in the tragic fate of her daughter, the 9 Days Queen? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you will not be able to stop thinking about. Just a quick reminder, I am still churning out video versions of History Fix. You can watch those on either YouTube or patreon.com/historyfixpodcast. So if you think you would enjoy having visuals to go along with the story and seeing my face talking, telling the story, you can find the video version in either of those two places. We are going back to Tudor world today. You guys know I hate the Tudors. It's a fun world to get lost in either way. So I set out to make this episode about Lady Jane Grey. I haven't been able to stop thinking about her since the Bloody Mary episode, since the Henry VIII Six Wives episodes way back when. She's just always somewhere in the back of my mind. She haunts me. But as soon as I started digging into her story in order to put this episode together, I pretty quickly discovered another person entirely who desperately needed her story fixed. And so I unexpectedly shifted gears. Don't worry, this episode is still about Lady Jane Grey, and hopefully it will scratch that itch I've been having. But really, this episode is about Jane's mother, Frances Grey, who, not unlike her cousin, Mary Tudor, has been unfairly cast as an evil, cruel woman by the game of historical telephone. I was chatting with my husband, Joey, the other day about why he dislikes history. He's kind of a numbers guy. He likes math and science. And he was explaining to me that what he dislikes about history is the uncertainty of it all. That someone long ago could record something completely false or at least heavily skewed, and we would all believe it. And I get that, and I agree with him. It happens all the time. So then I tried to explain that the very reason he dislikes history is the same reason I like it, or at least the same reason I feel passionate about it. Passionate about fixing it. Because he's right. If someone writes something 500 years ago, and we still have access to that record, that old weathered piece of parchment or whatever, it seems so sacred, right? We don't even hesitate. We believe every word. We're like, yeah, he wrote this. He wrote this at the time, way back then, so it has to be true. Like, look how old this paper is. It has to be true. As if those two things are related at all. But in reality, if there's no evidence backing it, if there's nothing to corroborate it, it doesn't matter when it was written or who wrote it. It doesn't matter how old the paper is. It means very little, especially when the account we're talking about here, in this particular case, was based on a conversation with an upset 13-year-old girl. Have you ever met a 13-year-old girl? They will say literally anything. We'll come back to that. So let's talk about who Frances Grey, the mother of Jane Grey, was and her connection to the Tudors. So the Tudors, in case you've missed like absolutely everything I've ever talked about, the Tudors were a ruling family, a dynasty in England, starting with Henry VII, who never really should have been king to begin with. He was not like anywhere near being in line for king. He won it in battle, essentially, and also sort of through an advantageous marriage. The War of the Roses. It is coming soon, I promise. It's penciled in. The War of the Roses was the inspiration for the Game of Thrones series. It's on my list. But spoiler alert, Henry Tudor kills Richard III, wins the throne, usurps the throne, whatever, becomes the first Tudor monarch, King Henry VII. He has 4 children with his wife, Elizabeth of York, who was Richard III's niece, by the way. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. He killed her uncle, stole his throne, and is like, marry me. And she's like, sure. Whatever. They have 4 surviving children. Arthur is the oldest and the heir to the throne, although he dies before getting there. And then a daughter, Margaret, and then Henry, who will become King Henry VIII, and finally Mary, the youngest daughter. Mary is Henry VIII's younger sister, and she is also Frances Grey's mother. But Mary was never supposed to marry Francis' father at all. Mary was actually supposed to marry the King of France, Louis XII. My goodness, that got confusing. Mary, Francis, France. Yikes. And she did. Mary actually did marry Francis King Louis XII when she was 18 years old. And this was part of a peace treaty that her brother, Henry VIII, had arranged with France. He basically auctioned off his little sister in order to arrange this agreement with France. Mary wasn't into it. She was 18 and Louis was 52, which was like a very old man back then. And he was in poor health. She's like, seriously, dude, you're going to marry me off to this gross old man for the sake of some sort of political alliance. And Henry's like, yeah, that's how we do things. But he does promise her, he promises her that she could choose her next husband when Louis died, which by the looks of things might actually be quite soon. And so that's what convinced her to go along with this plan. Not that she had a choice anyway, but Mary married the King of France in 1514, becoming the Queen of France for just 82 days. Yeah, Louis died 82 days after their wedding without having produced an heir to the throne. Mary actually at that point went into a 40-day period of seclusion to determine if she was pregnant or not. Basically locked away for 40 days, no funny business, because if she was pregnant, that was the heir to the French throne, and they had to be sure it was actually the late Louis's baby. But she was not pregnant, so some other guy, Francis I, takes the throne. And she's essentially free of her duties now in France. So, that worked out nicely for her. Henry had promised Mary that she could choose her next husband, and she is determined to hold him to that now. In letters that she wrote to him after Louis died, she reminded him of this and threatened to join a nunnery if he didn't stick to his word. So Henry sends a close friend of his named Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, to France to congratulate the new king and also to bring Mary back to England. Now this is perfect for Mary because she already has a huge crush on Charles Brandon. Charles and Henry were close friends since childhood. This is her big brother's friend whom she's admired, since she was a girl. And here he comes to whisk her back to England. And here she is in this rare position to choose her own husband, which was not common at all at the time, especially not for a princess. Henry must have at least had suspicions about his sister's secret feelings for Charles, because he made him promise before he left to go retrieve Mary that he would not, under any circumstances, propose marriage to her. And Charles promised. And then he pretty much immediately broke that promise. Jessica Brain writes for History Extra, quote, "The couple then went on to marry in secret in Paris on the 3rd of March, 1515, with only 10 guests, one of whom was King Francis I. Such a union proved daring, not only as it meant that Charles' promise to Henry was unfulfilled, but also he had married a princess without the consent of the king, technically constituting an act of treason. When news arrived in England about the forbidden marriage taking place, Henry was livid, and the Privy Council subsequently advised that Charles should be imprisoned and subsequently executed. Fortunately for Brandon, Mary was Henry's favorite sibling, and with the intervention of Cardinal Wolsey, Charles was able to escape the prospect of being beheaded and instead faced a substantial fine, which included the dowry from Louis XII and the gifts given to Mary by King Louis. With the settlement agreed, the couple were officially married on the 13th of May, 1515 at Greenwich Palace, attended by royal courtiers and, of course, Henry VIII himself. Charles also secured a papal bull from the Pope, legitimizing the marriage, which had been viewed by many as Mary marrying below her station, end quote. So because it was technically below her station, they had to get approval from the Pope for this marriage. And so this is, obviously before Henry had broken with the Catholic Church and split ties with the Pope. They're still a Catholic country, and they need the Pope's approval for this and for lots of things. So Mary and Charles' first child together was Frances, the subject of this episode. She was born in 1517, and so that made her the niece of King Henry VIII. So just for some context, Henry's first surviving child with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was Mary, and she will go on to become Queen Mary I. She was born in 1516. So Frances and Mary were cousins. They were first cousins with only a 1-year age difference. Mary was also Frances's godmother. I don't know why you would make a 1-year-old your daughter's godmother, but whatever. That's what happened. So Frances seems, thinking about the name Frances now, it seems a fitting old-timey girl's name now, but at the time it was actually a very unusual name. No one was naming their daughter Frances in England at that time. It was a female version of the male name Francis with an I instead of an E, who of course was King of France at the time, Francis I. And so a lot of people think that maybe they chose this unusual name because of Mary's ties to France, her mother's ties to France as the Dowager Queen of France, but who knows? Not much is known about Frances' childhood. We know that she lived in Suffolk because her parents were the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk. She had a normal amount of education for a girl of her status. She was a close relative of the king, and so obviously of quite high standing in society. We do know that her mother, Mary Tudor Brandon, died in 1533 when Frances was just 16 years old. And then it got real weird because soon after that, her father, Charles Brandon, married his 14-year-old ward, Catherine Willoughby. So this was like a young aristocratic girl he had taken into his household. I imagine she would have been sort of like a younger sister figure to Frances. And I imagine her father's marriage to this very young girl soon after her mother's death would have been difficult for Frances, but who knows? I mean, really, who knows? Different times. Now I'm like, she's 14, someone arrest that man. But I guess it wasn't necessarily like that back then. So Frances got married herself, actually, though, right before her mother died in 1533. So she had already left her father's household before he married his child bride situation. Frances herself was a child bride. At only 16, she married Henry Grey, who was the third Marquis of Dorset. So they got married in 1533, just for some context, this was the same year that Henry VIII, her uncle, married his second wife, Anne Boleyn. So 1533, Henry marries Anne Boleyn, and they have Elizabeth, who will go on to become Queen Elizabeth I. Francis marries Henry Grey. Francis' mother, Mary Tudor Brandon, dies, and Francis' father, Charles Brandon, marries his 14-year-old ward. All the same year. So, big year. Francis and Henry Grey have 3 surviving children together, all girls. The oldest is Jane, named after Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife and current wife when Jane is born in 1537. And then there's Catherine and Mary, of course, because everyone is either Jane, Catherine, or Mary. Everyone but Frances, apparently, with her trendy New Age name. So let's talk about Jane for a minute, the girl I can't stop thinking about. Jane was bookish. She was very intelligent. She was highly educated, more than was typical for a Tudor girl. She studied under John Aylmer, who is described as a, quote, English bishop, constitutionalist, and Greek scholar. I'm really not sure what makes him a Greek scholar, considering he lived in 16th century England, not ancient Greece. I guess he just studied Greek stuff. I said it before, I'll say it again. We pretty much still live in ancient Athens, guys. Their philosophy is still kicking. Kicking then, kicking now, it's always kicking. So under the tutelage of John Aylmer, Jane excelled in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. You know, just the really useful languages. And she exchanged letters with Protestant reformers on the continent, right? Which is like mainland Europe, not the British Isles. And that's unconventional. I mean, we're talking about Jane is like 10 years old at this point. She's a little girl, and she's involved in this kind of scholarly activity and exchange. And this really took off in 1547 when she was 10, and she went to live as a ward of Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. And this arrangement is actually super important, so we're going to talk about it for a bit. I've mentioned wards before. I mentioned Francis' father, Charles Brandon, marrying his 14-year-old ward after his wife died. Wards were typically children of nobility who went to live with another noble family to the point where that person actually became their legal guardian for a time. So why was this done? It would have been done most of the time if the ward's parents had died, right? People died a lot back then. So if your parents die, they were orphaned. They don't throw noble children into orphanages. So the crown would have arranged a wardship for them with another noble family. It was also sometimes done just because it was an advantageous arrangement, as was the case for Jane. They were hoping to get something out of it. So Catherine Parr was Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. She was his wife when he died in January of 1547. And then very soon after that, just a few months later, Catherine married Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour was the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. And he was not a great guy, okay? He was pretty skeezy. But Catherine had sort of always been in love with him ever since she met him while part of Princess Mary's household at court. It was like love at first sight. Before marrying Henry in 1453, she actually confessed to being in love with Thomas Seymour. She's like, I mean, I love Thomas Seymour, but okay, I guess I'll marry the king. So as soon as Henry was out of the way, as soon as he died, Catherine and Thomas got married. Thomas had an older brother, Edward Seymour, who served as Lord Protector, as regent for the boy king, Henry's son, Edward. Because Thomas and his older brother, Edward, they were Henry's son, Edward's uncles, right? Jane Seymour was his mother, they were her brothers, so they were his uncles. And the oldest of them, Edward Seymour, served basically as regent. And this made Thomas, the younger brother, exceedingly jealous. Okay, his skeeziness will come clear soon. So Jane went to live as a ward of Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. And this was advantageous because Catherine was the stepmother of the heir to the throne. right? Henry's only surviving son, 9-year-old Edward VI, and Thomas was his uncle. And so she's placed within the inner circle of the new king here. And it appears the hopes were that 10-year-old Jane would someday marry 9-year-old Edward. And yes, they were closely related. By my calculations, Edward was Jane's first cousin once removed, the first cousin of her mom, Frances. Historian and author Susan Higginbotham writes in her blog, History Refreshed, New Perspectives on Old Times, quote, Henry VIII died in 1547. Shortly afterward, the Greys performed the first act for which history has damned them, agreeing to Thomas Seymour's request that they put Jane Grey in his wardship, in the hopes that Thomas would broker a match between Jane and the young King Edward VI. This has been taken as proof of the Greys' insatiable ambition. But what noble parent, given the opportunity to match their daughter with a king, would have passed up the chance? Like any other girl of her class, Jane would have been brought up with the expectation that she would marry for the good of her family. This was a two-way street. Jane would have also expected that her parents do their best for her future by marrying her to a high-status groom. Whether Jane was aware of these plans for her is unknown, but there is no reason to assume that the possibility of marriage to the king, her first cousin, would have displeased her. End quote. Jane is flourishing academically during this time. She's also very advantageously placed within the inner circle of King Edward VI. The Princess Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth I, also lives with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, for a time at the same time as Jane. Elizabeth would have been something like 13, Jane 10, so they were like somewhat close in age. But here's where Thomas Seymour's skeeziness starts to show. Just months before he married Catherine Parr and right after the king died, when Elizabeth was only 13 years old, Thomas sent her a letter asking her to marry him. This was not okay. You can't just marry a princess because you want to, right? You have to get like counsel, permission, and all that. Remember, Charles Brandon almost got executed for doing this. According to Professor Susanna Lipscomb, writing for History Extra, quote, Elizabeth rejected his proposal elegantly, also by letter, saying she was too young. She was 13 years old. He, at 38, was 25 years older than she, and would be in mourning for her father for 2 years, end quote. Translation, leave me alone, you creepy old man. Not that 38 is old, but, she was 13, so yeah, it's old. So fast forward, Thomas marries Catherine Parr, probably just to get closer to Elizabeth, who was her stepdaughter. Poor Catherine, she genuinely loved this guy for some reason, and I feel like he's just totally using her. So while Elizabeth was living with Catherine and Thomas, a lot of scandalous stuff went down. A lot of grooming, very Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell. I was going to launch into it here, but it's just too long of a side road to go down, so I'm going to mini fix it. If you aren't on the Patreon yet, patreon.com/historyfixpodcast, you might want to be for this one. That's going to come out on Wednesday. It is scandalous. It is juicy. There are barely clothed early morning bedroom visits. There is tickling, there is spanking, there is wrestling. It gets real weird. But this episode is not about Elizabeth and her step-parents, so I'm going to mini fix it, okay? Don't miss that one. Back to Jane. Remember, Jane is living with Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour starting in 1547. But Catherine Parr dies in September of 1548, and so Jane goes back to live with her parents. I don't know if she was abused by Thomas like Elizabeth or not. I don't think so. No evidence comes out of that. But Catherine dies, and her parents are like, we're kind of in this for Catherine. This guy's a little too skeezy. We don't know about this guy. And they bring Jane back home. But skeezy Thomas goes, actually, you can't do that. I'm legally her ward. She has to be returned to my household. And so they send Jane back, and she moves into Catherine's old apartments. Thomas is still planning to arrange a marriage between Jane and the boy king Edward VI. So I'm sure that helps persuade her parents to send her back, right? It must have felt much less like she was being kidnapped by a pedophile, which was actually what was happening. But also, the scandal with Elizabeth hasn't come out yet. That won't come out for another 6 months. And what ultimately brings all of that out is another scandal that happens. King Edward has become rather distrustful of his two Seymour uncles, one who has been serving as Lord Protector and the other who is apparently sexually abusing his sister. So Edward starts to distance himself from them. Thomas ain't having it. He wants to be Lord Protector. He wants to control the king. He wants the power. He snaps. He breaks into King Edward's apartments in the middle of the night in an attempt to kidnap him. How that would help the situation, I don't know, but that's his plan. He's going to kidnap and control the king somehow. But when he breaks in, this is sad, sorry. When he breaks in, Edward's dog starts barking at him. And so he shoots the dog to quiet it so that it won't alert the guards. The barking won't alert the guards, but then the gunshot alerts the guards, who spring into action and apprehend Thomas. He is convicted of treason for trying to kidnap the king and also for trying to marry Princess Elizabeth without approval from the council. This is when that whole scandal comes out with him and Elizabeth, and he is executed, beheaded in 1549. Okay, so needless to say, Jane goes back to live with her parents at this point. The next year, something happens that will impact her mother, Frances Grey's reputation in irreparable ways. If you remember, this episode is actually about the misrepresentation of Frances Grey. So let's get back to that. Higginbotham writes, quote, "It was in August 1550, however, that Frances made the biggest mistake of her life, at least in terms of her historical reputation. She went hunting with the rest of the household and left her daughter Jane behind to greet a visitor, Roger Ascham. It was then that Jane made her famous complaint about her parents, recalled by Ascham years later after Jane and her parents were all dead." End quote. Roger Ascham was an English scholar and writer. He had served as Princess Elizabeth's tutor for a few years leading up to this encounter with Jane. So the rest of the family goes off hunting. Jane stays behind with Roger Ascham because she's a scholar and she likes talking to other scholars. And here is what she supposedly tells him, which he writes down from memory much, much later. Quote, "For when I am in presence either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silent, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it, as it were, in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world. Or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yea, presently sometimes with pinches, nips, and bobs, and other ways, which I will not name for the honor I bear them, so without measure misordered, that I think myself in hell, till time come that I must go to Mr. Elmer, who teacheth me so gently, so pleasantly, with such fair allurements to learning, that I think all the time nothing whiles I am with him. And when I am called from him, I fall on weeping, because whatsoever I do else but learning is full of grief, trouble, fear, and whole misliking unto me. And thus my book hath been so much my pleasure, and bringeth daily to me more pleasure and more, that in respect of it, all other pleasures in very deed be but trifles and troubles unto me." End quote. That is what Jane told Ascham, or rather, it's what Ascham recalled years later, Jane telling him. So these were complaints that she had about her parents. Notice parents. She says, when I am in the presence either of father or mother. But no one cares about the father part for some reason. Everyone latches on to the mother part. And this is used to absolutely eviscerate Frances Grey's character. Higginbotham writes, quote, "The impact of Ascham's recollection on Frances' reputation simply cannot be understated. Historians and novelists alike have used it to construct an image of Jane's entire childhood as more Dickensian than anything that Dickens himself could have imagined, brightened only by Jane's brief stay at Catherine Parr's household. Any possibility that the adolescent Jane, like other intelligent adolescents, might have been exaggerating her complaints, that she might have spoken less harshly of her parents with time and maturity, or that her parents might have had genuine cause by contemporary standards for disciplining her, has been ignored by all but a handful of writers." End quote. We see this account told by an upset 13-year-old girl. Keep that in perspective, right? We see it blossom in the writings of future historians and authors when discussing Frances Grey. They take serious license in elaborating on her character based on this. In her biography of Jane Grey, author Mary Luke mentions Frances shaking her infants, which there is absolutely no evidence of whatsoever. A biography about Frances' friend, Bess of Hardwicke, accuses Frances of cruelty to her servants, although we have no records of any of them ever complaining of that. And actually, Frances will go on to marry one of her servants after the death of her husband, which suggests the complete opposite was true. We see a reputation arise that Frances was obsessed with hunting, just because she went on this hunting trip one time that we know about, the time that Jane made her complaint to Ascham. And then she gets twisted into this bloodthirsty huntress in a really off-putting, sort of violent way. Higginbotham writes, quote, "Frances' one recorded absence on a hunting trip has given rise to its own series of legends. Although no one actually knows whether Frances enjoyed hunting or whether she went on hunting trips merely out of a sense of social obligation, this has not stopped authors like Hester Chapman from droning on about, quote, her tireless enjoyment of open-air sports and indoor games. Or Alison Weir from assuring us that Frances was, quote, never happier than when she was on horseback. Or Mary Luke from writing, quote, at Bradgate, she could slaughter and maim to her heart's content. Luke also mentions the Greys dining, quote, in the hall hung with the heads of Lady Frances' unfortunate victims. One can only hope that Luke was referring to deer, end quote. So there's so much creative license being taken here, which is a really dangerous thing when it comes to history. I read you what 13-year-old Jane said, what her complaints about her parents were, according to Roger Ascham's memory years later. That is what all this is being based on. There is no evidence of baby shaking or cruelty to servants or ripping rabbits' heads off with her teeth or whatever they're trying to get at with the stuff about her loving hunting and being all bloodthirsty and violent. Jane talks about nips and bobs. Nips and bobs? Y'all, I got nips and bobs in the 1990s, please. I know we aren't nipping and bobbing our children these days, but until very recently, this is how parenting was done for all of time. I'm not sure how a 13-year-old's complaints of nips and bobs got so horribly twisted into Frances being this bloodthirsty, abusive mother. I'm not really seeing it, even in what Jane supposedly said there. And that is what we're basing literally this whole woman's reputation on. Nips and bobs. But I don't think what Ascham wrote alone would have been enough to tarnish Frances' reputation. I think that came about because of what happened to Jane soon after. The horribly tragic fate of this innocent girl and the need to blame someone for it. So let's go there now. We know there were earlier plans to marry Jane off to the King Edward VI, But those plans fell apart after Thomas Seymour's treason and after the older uncle, Edward Seymour, was replaced as Lord Protector, right? The Seymours are out. He was replaced by a man named John Dudley. To clarify, Lord Protector, because I keep throwing that term out there, it's essentially King Regent in this case. So they're acting as king because Edward was still a child, right? Edward Seymour, the former regent, was actually executed for treason, just like his brother Thomas, but in 1552 for plotting to overthrow this new guy, the new Lord Protector, the new regent, John Dudley. So these Seymour brothers were just jealous, conniving dudes, right? So Jane's marriage to the king is kind of out of the window. It was the Seymours who were going to broker that marriage. They're dead. They're traitors. They're beheaded. They're gone. That's kind of off the table now, right? But her parents still want her in that inner circle, and so they marry her off to Guildford Dudley, who was the son of John Dudley, the new regent to the king. Right around this same time, 1553, it becomes clear that Edward VI, who's still only 15 years old, is dying, probably from tuberculosis. And he does something rather shocking right before he dies. He altered his father's plan that he had set out for succession to the throne. Henry had planned for the crown to pass to Edward, of course, which it did, and then to any male heirs that Edward would someday have. But if Edward didn't have any male heirs, it would pass then to Mary, Henry's oldest surviving child. So Edward is now dying at 15 without any heirs at all. The crown is supposed to pass to Mary next, per her father's instructions that he left, right? But last second plot twist, Edward alters the line of succession, and he, out of literally nowhere, he puts Jane Grey in line for the throne next. And I say Edward does this, but remember, it's really John Dudley, the Lord Protector, the regent, who is making this decision. Edward was still too young when he died to rule without a regent. The reason given, or just kind of assumed at least at the time, is that Mary is Catholic. Mary is very, very Catholic, and England does not want a Catholic monarch. They have tried very hard to separate themselves from Catholicism, the Protestant Reformation, the Church of England that Henry created in order to divorce his first wife. They don't want a Catholic queen. And Jane is Protestant. Fine. But what about Elizabeth? Elizabeth is Protestant. Why not put her on the throne? And what about Frances, Jane's mother? Frances had more ties to the throne than her daughter Jane. Frances was Henry VIII's niece, right? So that logic doesn't make sense. But when you look at the other motive there, okay, Jane was married to John Dudley's son. She was his daughter-in-law. If Jane were to become Queen Regnant of England, he would still hold a lot of power and influence over the monarchy. Also, any son that Jane might have, his grandson, would become the next king of England. It would put a Dudley on the throne. So when you consider all of that, it becomes a lot clearer how Jane's name got thrown out there. Jane was proclaimed queen shortly after Edward's death and goes to the Tower of London to await her coronation. But before the coronation can take place, Mary storms into London. She has gathered all these supporters, and she storms into London wearing this elaborate velvet purple gown that just reeks of royalty. And there's no battle or anything like that. She just sort of waltzes in, and everyone's like, yeah, okay. What were we thinking? Of course, you're the queen. And she just takes the throne. They just give it to her because it's obvious that she's the one who's supposed to sit there, right? And Jane and her father, Henry Grey, and John Dudley, and his son, Jane's husband, Guildford Dudley, and some other guys that were part of this plot, they are all arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Frances flies into a frenzy. She manages to get a meeting with Queen Mary. They were first cousins, only a year apart. Remember, they were like buddies, and Mary was Francis' godmother, so they were really tight. She manages to get a meeting with Mary and get her husband out of prison. She negotiates his release, but not Jane's. And she is judged super harshly for this now, but we don't really know. Like, she might have tried and was just unsuccessful in getting Jane out. We have no idea. We do know that Mary did not intend to have Jane executed. She knew none of this was Jane's doing, and she planned to release Jane after her coronation. And so there wasn't like this huge pressure to get Jane out. Jane was safe, right? But Francis is harshly judged for not being successful, at least in getting Jane released. But before that could happen, before Jane could be released, an unfortunate event took place. In January of 1554, a politician named Wyatt the Younger declared a revolt against Queen Mary. He was anti-Catholic, and he opposed her succession to the throne. A rebellion broke out called Wyatt's Rebellion that sought to put Protestant Elizabeth on the throne instead. Elizabeth had nothing to do with this rebellion or this plot or anything like that. Jane's father, Henry VIII, who Francis had managed to get out of prison, he stupidly joins this rebellion. It fails. Henry gets captured. He, along with the other rebels, is accused of treason and set to be executed. Beheaded, as was the punishment for treason. Now, originally, remember, Mary was planning to let Jane go. But now that her father had taken part in this rebellion against her, it's too risky. And she decides that she has to execute Jane too. All because her stupid father joined this stupid and unsuccessful rebellion. And for some reason, it's her mother that everyone loves to hate. So Jane and her husband and her father were all executed in February following the failed revolt. And this puts Frances in a very bad situation. I mean, she's tragically lost her husband and her daughter, so she's heartbroken over that, I'm sure. But she also has two other young daughters to care for, and the family is in ruin at this point. Her husband has tried to overthrow the queen. You don't really get to come back from that socially, right? She fell on the mercy of Mary. She goes to Mary for help. And Mary kept her at court, but not like to take care of her. It was more to observe her and keep an eye on her and her daughters and make sure that there was no more funny business. And Frances and her daughters, Catherine and Mary, they lived in poverty throughout the rest of Mary's reign. And it was precarious because they were all potential claimants to the throne, which made them a threat to Mary, which was a very dangerous thing to be, obviously. So to lessen that threat, Frances remarried well below her station. And I'm not talking about like marrying a duke like her princess mother did. She married one of her servants. Just for context, because I'm sort of thinking of Frances at this point as like an old lady, she's still only 37 years old here. So she married her master of horse, one of her servants named Adrian Stokes. And she probably did this because it made her and her daughters and any future children she or they might have much less of a threat, right? You don't get to marry your servant and then become the next queen. But also, they appear to have had a happy marriage. Elizabeth was reportedly very jealous of their happiness. Elizabeth, who was sexually abused by her step-parents as a 13-year-old and imprisoned by her sister as a 20-year-old. So yeah, a lot of trauma there, but whatever. Frances and Adrian seem to have a happy marriage. Frances died in 1559 at the age of 42 and was buried at Westminster Abbey. She has a really nice effigy, which is like a carved sculpture of her laying on top of her tomb that is still at Westminster Abbey. So if you ever get to go there, maybe you can check it out. It's the only known surviving contemporary image that we have of Frances. This effigy statue. There is a portrait floating around, and I actually use it in a reel that I'm putting out today, that was supposed to be Frances. It's not like for sure Frances. But this statue, this effigy of her at Westminster Abbey is like the only actual legit contemporary likeness of her that we have. And that was put there by her second husband and former servant, Adrian Stokes. So if anything, I think that's a testament to the fact that they were sort of a solid couple, that he would do this for her after her death, which says a lot about Frances and sort of directly contradicts claims others have made since that she was this evil woman who was cruel to her servants and her children. So where did this bad reputation come from? The only primary source that we have, the only shred of any record of it we have, is that account recorded by Roger Ascham based on what 13-year-old Jane reportedly said about her parents while they were out hunting that day. How did it get so twisted against Frances? I think it's kind of like what I talked about last week with Joan of Arc. Frances' story is like a life told backwards. Her reputation was sealed not by who she actually was in life, but what happened to her daughter. Like looking back, what happened to her daughter Jane, right? Poor, innocent Jane. Over the centuries, Jane's character developed more and more as a helpless victim, a pawn. And she was, but with that evolution of Jane, Frances evolved naturally, like Cinderella style, into the evil mother figure, the archetype of female wickedness that we love to throw into all the stories. But when you really look at it, it wasn't Frances' fault really at all. Jane may have been a pawn, but Frances wasn't playing the game. That was Thomas Seymour and John Dudley and her own father, Henry Grey. These men who wanted power are the ones who played Jane like a pawn, put her in harm's way, got her killed. Frances had more claim to the throne than Jane did. If she was after power, she would have been against crowning Jane queen. She would have insisted instead that she was the successor to the throne. So why are we sabotaging Frances and turning a blind eye to the men who are really at fault here? Because this is what our society does to women. Don't even get me started down this road again. This episode has already gotten too long. Revisit episode 104 about Aspasia of Miletus or episode 107 about Bloody Mary for more on this theory that I have. Susan Higginbotham has another theory. She writes, quote, "But there is another reason, I think, why Frances has become such a loathed figure, at least among women, and that is Jane herself. Jane, the girl who preferred reading a book to hunting with the family, is the thinking girl's heroine. She's the sort of girl who hated gym class, who hated going to family gatherings and having to make small talk with her dreary relations, who spent her lunch hour hiding out in the library. She's the sort of girl who grows into a reader and often into a writer. When female readers and authors come across Jane's complaint to Roger Ascham, they do not picture just Jane, but themselves. In that situation, poor Frances doesn't stand a chance." End quote. So we see a problem here. We see a problem where interpreters of history project their own lives onto it. They take it out of context. They take creative license in their retellings in order to force it into a particular storytelling template that is familiar to them. Frances going on a hunting trip one time turns into her, for example, in the 1986 film Lady Jane Grey, it opens on a scene where Frances is killing a deer in this sort of unsettling, bloodthirsty way. She's slaughtering this poor defenseless animal, this deer. And then it switches to Jane, meek, gentle little Jane, reading a book inside the house. It's like they're trying to draw a parallel here, right? A metaphor where Jane is the deer. Jane is the prey, and her mother is hunting her. And this is all based on this one time Frances went hunting. They've built this whole villainous character around it. We see Frances portrayed over and over as a cruel tyrant of a mother, void of affection for her daughters, intent on climbing the social ladder, all twisted and forged from the rantings of a 13-year-old remembered years later. In reality, if we look at what we actually know about Frances, a different character emerges entirely. Frances provided for her daughters the best possible education. Jane was surrounded by books and learning. She conversed with scholars as a young girl. That's actually what she was doing when she made those complaints to Roger Ascham. She was allowed to skip the hunting trip in order to stay back and do what she loved doing, which was having scholarly conversations with scholars. That doesn't sound like an abusive or neglectful childhood necessarily to me. Frances tried to secure the best possible life for Jane. She sent her to Catherine Parr's household in order to potentially secure her a marriage match with the King of England. When Jane was later named as successor to the throne, Frances could have fought that. She had a better claim to it herself than Jane did. She could have fought and tried to put herself on the throne, but she didn't. After the executions of Jane and her husband, Frances did what she had to do to protect her two remaining daughters. She fell on Queen Mary's mercy, lived in poverty, destroyed whatever was left of her reputation by marrying a servant, all to make her daughters, possible claimants to the throne, less of a threat. I don't see cruelty in Frances. I see desperation. I see desperate attempts to make the very male-dominated world of 16th century England a hospitable place for her three daughters. I see a mother doing whatever she has to do to secure a life for them in a society in which they are powerless. And to a 13-year-old girl, that might seem abusive at times. Jane said, quote, "Whether I speak, keep silent, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it, as it were, in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world." End quote. But why, Jane? Why did your mother insist on this kind of perfection from you? Was it out of hate, or was it possibly out of love? Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at History Fix Podcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from Historic UK, Westminster Abbey, SusanHigginbotham.com, the Tudor Society, Wikipedia, History Extra, and Royal Museums, Greenwich. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.